I should say from the start, although I do work for United Nations Development Program in Beijing, I am presenting personal views. I'm not speaking on behalf of the UN. I hope I'm not going to say anything which contradicts key UN messages in any deep way, but this is just me talking, and I want to add that this is the first time I'm giving a presentation on the material that I'm using here. It's coming from work I've been doing recently, so it might not be quite as polished as some of the other presentations we've already seen today, but please indulge me. So as Clay mentioned, and as he said, as everyone here indeed does know already, China's track record in poverty reduction in the last 40 years has been really historic. It's one of the great human developments of modern times. The most populous country in the world has gone from being a poor country with over 1 billion people living below the global poverty lines to an upper middle income country which is continuing to grow and develop quite rapidly. This is a staggering achievement. The number of people who are still poor, even by that rather low global poverty line that the World Bank sets, is still high, probably around 60 million, but compared to the situation before, it's really absolutely astounding. As most of you probably also know, the Chinese government now has a very strong goal, and that is by 2020, eliminate absolute poverty. Living in Beijing, watching the news a lot, this is a constant theme on the news. The government's, it's a war on poverty. What's to be done? The UN works a lot with the Ministry of Commerce in China. There are window in the Chinese government, even the Ministry of Commerce, every ministry, every province, lots of companies will be hearing about Wanda's work also, are all being enlisted to put resources into this effort to eliminate poverty by 2020. So that's very exciting and quite remarkable. What I'm talking about today, however, is not that effort. What I'm talking about today is what's going to come afterwards. After 2020, what are the next wave, the next generation of poverty challenges that China faces? That's an artificial distinction. Those challenges exist today already. They've existed for some time already. But in any case, from the point of view of government policy, the period up to 2020 is focusing on that goal that I just mentioned. Then what? How did this? That will most easily be understood with just a little bit of discussion about how the achievements of the last 40 years occurred. And so it's worth keeping in mind that although government policy, government anti-poverty policy has played a role, there's not much doubt, even among Chinese scholars in this field, that the main reason for poverty reduction in China has simply been growth. That basically in the Mao years, although the society stabilized quite a bit, although life expectancy grew, as we saw in one of the tables this morning, although some basic social systems were put in place, economic growth was held down. This was the policy. We do not want bourgeois liberalism in China, but we don't want people to be motivated by the wish to make money. So basically in 1978, when the reform and opening up era started, there was this tremendous entrepreneurship, this urge for it, which had been held back for so long, just ready to burst free. And the first thing that Deng Xiaoping did, this very remarkable leader was simply say, government's going to start getting out of the way of people. Let people want to make money. Let people who are capable of making money make some money. Let farmers, and this was a critical part of it, let farmers make some money from what they grow, choose things to grow, have more freedom and independence in what they grow and how they sell it. And that's how the economic boom started. And one of the important points in that is, unlike some countries that have grown rapidly for spurts, in China, a lot of the growth in the beginning, the first 10 years really, was based in the countryside. It was agricultural growth. It was setting up small manufacturing, township and village enterprises in the countryside. This is a classic case of what economists would call inclusive growth. It wasn't growth concentrated in small areas for small population groups. It was based much more broad-based. And as then the economy started and society started to urbanize, you had further impacts on poverty alleviation from people being free for the first time since the establishment of the People's Republic to move from the countryside where their income earning possibilities were very low to urban areas where they could earn more. So this is the basic pattern. This was inclusive growth where jobs were generated, people were free to earn money and to move to find wherever their opportunities were. But then the question is, with that background and things changing so rapidly in China, where are we now and what are the key challenges now and what needs to be done now? So you see the last line of this slide. The last few months, I've been leading some work at UN in Beijing, together with some very good Chinese counterparts, and looking at global experiences that are relevant for China's new generation of poverty challenges. So it's not only urban, it's not only rural poverty, and it's not even more, it's not just rural poverty in poor counties and poor townships and poor villages, which is how it's very much defined now too. So there are some poverty counties and poverty townships and villages. That's where the work is focused now. Poverty exists everywhere. It exists in wealthier rural areas, it exists in cities. There are groups who are being left behind, even while the rest are rising. There are other new forms of poverty, such as environmental poverty. I was very happy to hear that touched on by Pat Young's talk this morning. Environmental poverty is a very real thing. We'll discuss that more in a moment. And what's interesting in this is, although growth has been the main source of poverty, that momentum to reduce poverty for the last 40 years, these problems, urban poverty, environmental poverty, these pockets of poverty among overall wealthy groups of people, those are not problems that growth will solve. These require different approaches. So here are some of the new challenges that China faces. And this first one is a very interesting one, and that is, well, you know, it's that World Bank global poverty line, $1.90 a day is what it is now. That's a very useful line, especially when you're a poor country. But when you become a country with a GDP per capita like China's, $8,500 a year or more, how relevant is that? $1.90 a day, what's that? $600, $700 a year? I mean, that's so poor. By World Bank global standards, maybe you're no longer considered poor then. By Chinese standards, you have to be considered poor. And so even if just looking at income lines, as you keep growing, you need to keep raising that line, and that's what countries do. And interestingly, just last year, the World Bank, recognizing how the whole world is changing, has come up with some new suggested poverty lines for different levels of development. I mentioned them here. So a higher line for lower middle income countries and an even higher line for upper middle income countries. So if you applied either of those lines, especially the $550 a day line to China, I mean, the number of poor people would be in the hundreds of millions once again. And of course, the logic behind changing those lines should be clear. Just think about the US. You know, what sense would it make to say anyone who makes $1,000 a year is not poor? You need a different line to reflect your actual conditions. Another aspect of looking at measuring income-based poverty is looking at relative lines instead of absolute lines. Developed economies almost always, although not the US, set poverty lines based on the overall income level. In the European Union, for example, the poverty line is based as a percentage of the median household income. So those are income-based lines. Even more important is, as your economy changes and develops, income is not the key measure of poverty. It's one, but multidimensional measures of poverty. And this is a hot topic in China today. There's a tremendous discussion on that, and there's a lot of global experience on this. You need to look at other non-income measures. Do you have access to clean water? Do you have access to education? Do you have, are you safe? What kind of housing do you live in? If you have 50 people living in a small apartment, even if your income isn't so low, isn't that a very real form of poverty? So multidimensional poverty measures are becoming more and more important globally and are very much on the agenda in China for the coming years, and particularly in urban areas where cash incomes tend to be higher, but these other forms of deprivations tend to be very serious. Another challenge, and this is a classic challenge for an upper middle income country like China, is it's not so much poverty any longer. The number of poor people is smaller because you've grown quite far. It's vulnerability. It's the risk of falling back into poverty. It's needing systems in place to protect people from falling back if they get sick, if they lose their work, if there's some natural disaster. So in China, because China has developed so quickly, a lot of the normal systems, such as the ones I list here, are not very strong yet. The ones that would protect people from falling back into poverty. And this is one of the key themes in the research we've been doing. So globally, what are the methods that have been found to address this vulnerability challenge? And I was quite struck listening to the talks this morning, particularly the education, but the aging as well, by one key point, and that is, once you've reached a level of development like this, poverty is not simply a poverty problem. It's not a problem that can be dealt with by having an anti-poverty agency or an anti-poverty program. It requires education. It requires health care, as we heard this morning, to have a good educational system that produces good educational outcomes. You have to be looking at health care as well. You have to be looking at early childhood development. You have to be looking at agriculture. You have to be looking at food supply and nutrition. In China right now, all of those are handled by different government ministries, and there's good experience in upper middle income countries, especially Brazil and some of the Latin American countries, in setting up coordinated, integrated systems to deal with some of those problems. One that I wait to see, and it's under discussion in China, and Brazil is a very good model for it, is a really good school feeding program. A national school feeding program that says all schools should be required to provide a certain level of nutrition to every one of their children. Because what better opportunity do you have than that to address that problem? The kids are right there. Give them the food. Make sure they're getting the nutrition that they need. So that requires the Brazilian program. It requires Ministry of Agriculture, Health, Education, finance people all working together, of course. You need, as has also been touched on, coordination vertically. You set the policy in Beijing, it needs to be implemented successfully down below as well. Inequality, this is another classic issue that comes up with as your economy grows. When you're poor, everyone, it seems roughly the same, almost. As you grow, the gaps between wealthy and poor become larger and larger. So this is in China a huge issue, and you saw in Clay's initial presentation, the issues on people's minds. Inequality is on everybody's minds. You walk even in Beijing and you see the Lamborghinis drive by as you walk through a migrant neighborhood where people are leading very basic lifestyles. Classic, critical issue. Now that China has reached this level of development, poverty is can no longer be defined as a rural problem. There are huge urban poverty problems also. There are two levels of that. One is simply recognizing that urban poor are as big a problem as rural poor, and then within urban areas, distinguishing as well between people, the local residents, long-term urban hukou residents, and internal migrants who've come in, who are simply not captured in the systems. If you look for data on poverty in urban areas in China today, what you will find is some data, and we have Dory Solinger here, who knows as much about this topic as anybody alive. You'll find some data on urban hukou people who lost jobs, who for other reasons have fallen below the income level that is required, but you won't find any data on migrants who are poor, whether income poor or poor in those other multidimensional issues. We have elderly poverty. We heard that very impressive discussion about the options that are available for older people of means, but obviously that doesn't capture everybody. And the elderly who are lonely, who are depressed, who have lost the traditional social means of support. Now, many of them are also economically very vulnerable. And we have environmental poverty, as I mentioned earlier. That this is, UN has this position, and it's one which was embraced by the whole world when the world set the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. Environmental sustainability is as critical an issue as any other issue that mankind is facing right now. Humanity, I'm in California, humanity is facing right now. So we have, I offer a definition of environmental poverty here, and here is a classic case of a problem where growth not only doesn't solve the problem, growth can actually make the problem much worse unless you start from the assumption that only growth that's based on good management of natural resources, only growth that looks at what you're depleting and whether you can replace it rapidly enough to maintain sustainability. That's the only growth that is acceptable. And there's evidence over and over, and it's in China, and we saw photographs of that this morning in Pat Young's presentation. It's poor people who suffer the most when the environment is, from environmental degradation. They're poor people who don't have the ability to move away. It's poor people who don't have voice to speak up when these problems are taking place, and they feel the impact. So, I almost, China right now is so caught up in this goal. By 2020, we're going to eliminate poverty, that I feel bad to have to say, but actually eliminating poverty, it's like whack-a-mole. It's like playing a game of whack-a-mole. You eliminate one form of poverty, you rise, you grow, you develop, and boop, another one just pops up out of the ground. You know, so I'm sorry, China. You can eliminate most of that absolute income poverty, but there's going to be urban, multidimensional poverty, there's environmental poverty, and the line that you should be applying anyway, now that you've reached this level of development to your vast credit, should be a different line from that one that you've been using when you were poorer.